Hey everyone, good morning. It's so great to see so many of you back for day 2. Hopefully we have a good crowd online too. For those of you online, we have our panel on the camera and we didn't want to have to set it, move things around. So you won't be seeing me while I'm talking. I will be talking briefly and then we're going to hand it over to the panel. So I think we had such a successful day 1. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to everyone who presented. It was really inspiring. I know Emily was recognized at the beginning of the day, but I want to recognize her again because she spent hours setting up this technology. It was a challenge. We made it work. Thank you, Emily, so much for helping with all that. And Christiana Tagwitherall on Zoom also helped a bunch of that. And we have another Zoom facilitator today from Willamette Partnership. So, it takes a village to run a workshop, I guess. And also good news, we are going to hear from Jeremy Maestas at the end of the day today. That was the presentation where I was walking around with my phone and the microphone and I looked like a weirdo. We could not get him on Zoom. So we will be hearing from him later. I think that'll be a great way to close us out. Agenda, everyone should have an agenda. Either you picked one up or there should be one on your table. So you'll kind of know what the flow is. We are going to be moving venues midway through the day. And again, we're gonna end at 1:30 promptly. So for those of you that have a long drive, you should still have time to get home. So please stick with us. We're gonna be moving to the Elks Lodge. The address is on your agendas. It's 4 blocks down. Yeah, we're gonna walk together 4 blocks down the street that way. If I have my directions correct here. It's our field trip. Yeah, we're gonna do a field tour. We're gonna see downtown Burns. It's gonna be great. Okay. So let's, can you advance to the next slide then? Okay, well, I'll just start talking. So, bringing us back to our objectives, connect partners, share information, inspire action. We're going to continue on that vein, and we're going to kind of take it a little deeper today. The Harney County Wildfire Collaborative, and we have a bunch of panelists that will introduce themselves soon, are really going to take a deep dive into that and get some hands-on learning with how we sort of, are we good now? Yep. Okay. How we take these concepts and apply them. So yeah, if you can go to the next slide, Autumn. But maybe, I wonder, since they can't see me anyway, maybe I should just sneak over here. Okay, so title of the workshop. Okay, I gotta get a little bit of feedback. Sorry, guys. That help me. So, title of the workshop: Managing New Realities on the Range, using a novel approach to coordinate planning and management on large landscapes. And again, this is really driven by the Harney County Wildfire Collaborative. So big kudos to all the folks up here. So again, we went over our objectives. So this is our Defend and Grow the Core map for Oregon, right? So this is a big, this is the big picture. This connects sort of the whole sagebrush biome, right? But, and it helps us think about the landscape context of our work. It helps us sort of think about proactive management, shift our attention to sort of proactive approach. I'm gonna move over here and see if I get less feedback. Connecting our work in Oregon to the broader sagebrush biome. But again, we need to figure out how to step that down. So we're going to be sort of learning about that today. So if you go a couple slides ahead. So I'm going to sort of highlight a couple of spots, maybe 2 more. A couple of spots here, right? So there's a blob here on the sort of west side where that's core. That's core with the capital C. We can really defend and grow the core there. And that upper map there, those are our threat-based eco-states. So again, the greens are sort of the good condition, the state A, this is what we want. And there's the various threats. So there is a real opportunity to defend and grow the core. But, in this other landscape here, we heard some more about that. We heard about that yesterday. We'll hear some more about this area, the Stinking Water Mountains, today. There isn't any sort of capital C core, but these concepts are scalable. And it's not about any one map. Here are a couple of different maps that sort of represent ecological condition, ecological function. And so in some of these landscapes, you know, it's not about, well, okay, there's no core here, so we can't apply defend and grow the core. We can use these same concepts to say, okay, even in this much more impacted landscape, we have some core. We have some areas with sort of the highest ecological condition within our decision space, and we can apply these same concepts. And maybe these maps don't even represent that area that well. That's okay. We can use our local data, local knowledge to apply the concepts. So I just want to reinforce that the maps are a really helpful tool, but they are not an endpoint. They're not sort of a decision-making, they don't make a decision for you. What they hopefully do is get folks like this group and like the small groups you guys are going to get into later together to talk about kind of shared vision, what the landscape looks like, what is the context, what are our shared values, how do we need to work across fence lines to address the threats in this area and take as proactive of an approach as we can and get the most bang for our buck. So I was not looking at my notes, but I think those are the things I wanted to say. And I'm going to hand it over to the panel. Are you guys going to introduce yourselves first?
Yeah, we're doing Chad.
Chad first. Okay, we're going to hand it over to Chad Boyd, who is on the phone.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Try one more time. Now you're mic'd up.
Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Fantastic. So my name is Chad Boyd, and I'm research leader with the Agricultural Research Service in Burns at the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center. Pleasure to be here today. I wish I could be there, but again, I do appreciate being here. And so when we're talking about perennial bunch grasses, and we're going to talk a lot about perennial bunch grasses today, it's not a story, and to really understand the importance of perennial bunch, kind of got to go back in time. If we go back in time far enough, perennial bunch grass evolved in an environment in which, much like the one today, resources are variable in space and time. And so if you're a plant and you're living in, let's just think about water as a resource, right? So if you're living in a variable water environment, what do you plant? Well, structures that allow you to capture water when and where it's available. And in the case of perennial bunch grass, what they did is built this map system, and they put a lot of effort into that root system. What they didn't put a lot of effort into is seed production. They didn't put as many resources there. So what we ended up with is a plant that can survive very well, finely tuned to a variable environment. However, it doesn't have the seed to reproduce often. But that's okay, because in 1850 it didn't need to. We didn't have annual grasses in the mix. We fast forward to today, and it's a mixed bag. Annuals can still persist in a variable environment, and they can still occupy the rooting zone, surface rooting zone that's so important to annuals. And so they do provide, they're the primary measure of resistance to annual grass invasion, the biotic measure in sagebrush plant communities. However, sorry, I gotta get my dogs under control. Sorry. However, because they have seeds that are not that tend not to do well, use ever reestablish perennials, they have some problems with annuals, right? They're not evolved to be successful right here, right now. And that's a problem when we add annuals to the mix. So killing annuals, taking annuals out of the system is not that hard. There are a number of products and some new ones coming online that we can use to kill annuals. Frankly, they're pretty wimpy little plants. The trick is getting the perennials back in. The trick in establishing and maintaining resistant of big brush plant communities. It's getting the perennials back into place, and it's not a one and done thing. It's really a process. Because success rates are not typically high with reestablishment of perennial grasses. We're looking at a commitment that's going to stretch into the future, and it doesn't just stretch through time; it stretches through space. And when we think about space, we have to think about full ownerships. So we're a commit over time. We're making a commitment across multiple ownerships, and when we think about multiple ownerships, that presents some sociological challenge. That's what Katie's talking about next. Katie, go ahead.
Thanks, Chad. So for those of you who missed me yesterday, I'm Katie Wolstein. I'm the Range and Fire Specialist with OSU Extension at the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center in Burns. And Chad teed me off nicely. So we have some good science. We have some really impressive decision support tools. We looked at a lot of maps yesterday. So why can we still not put these practices on the ground? What's standing in our way? And what it comes down to is we have these social and administrative barriers, especially in this public lands context. So for example, Harney County is 75% public land. And so when you have, these mixed ownerships, you also have this mix of different values, different interests, different objectives, different budgetary timelines, different disciplinary staffing. And so all of that's mixing around on this landscape. And so it's really difficult to align our actions to implement collective actions on the ground, which is what a problem like invasive annual grasses requires. The other piece of this, and Jeff Rose is sitting back there and reminds us, he's part of the Wildfire Collaborative, what we decide to do needs to be defensible, both from an ecological standpoint, but also when we're talking about federal lands, some state lands, it also needs to be defensible because the public has an interest in these lands as well. We also have some knowledge gaps. We have, again, some good tools and resources, but it's hard to know what to do everywhere. Context is important. And I mean the ecological context, but I also mean the social context. This context spans kind of literal geographic space, but it also spans time, as Chad mentioned. The time horizons for a lot of these projects is enormous. Time horizons for collaboration is also painful and different and in flux. The third kind of scale we're talking about is, again, ownership. And so different interests are out there and we need to figure out how to align those. And then the big theme of yesterday, I think we heard in every presentation, is resources. How do we align resources to achieve these collective actions that we've identified? Go ahead. And so I think everyone in this room knows we can't treat everything everywhere, nor should we. It's important to be strategic. And that's what we're talking about today. And so it's important to be strategic in a couple ways. The first of these is where we work. And so I hope one takeaway from yesterday, certainly something I heard again and again, is we don't need to create new organizations, new structures necessarily. Where there's an existing social infrastructure, maybe it's a formal collaborative, maybe it's a group of people who are working together around the issue of salmon. It needs to be ecologically meaningful, and then again, align with the larger context, and then apply these contexts at scale. And so importantly, and this is a struggle I think for everyone in here, we have a history of putting projects on the ground, and they might be piecemeal and opportunistic because that's the way our funding structures are organized. But we're at the point where we need to understand and have an eye to and have this inform every step of the way. How do these individual projects collectively aggregate and translate to landscape scale outcomes? Because that's the scale that we need to be thinking about when it comes to invasives, when it comes to wildfire. The other thing is the scale that we work at. So there are different spheres of influence, right? Each of us are kind of operating. We have the local implementation team, for example. We also have people, at higher levels when we think of the pyramid of SageCon. And so we all have different capacities and different roles to play. And so thinking about how we all fit together in terms of a multi-level structure, we each have different abilities at different levels of governance. And so being strategic about bringing in that partner who does have an understanding of the workings at maybe, the state level or with the legislation is equally important to someone who has that tie to the landowner on the ground who, is in a project area, for example. What we do, this is so obvious, right? Be strategic in what we do. But the Defend the Core framework is a shift from thinking was this project successful? This project that we got some short-term funding for. Two, and I'm going to quote Chad Boyd here, are we making meaningful change across our spheres of influence and then over our careers, over these broader ecological timescales? Lastly, and I touched on this already, but I want to hit it again, being strategic in who we work with is essential. Everyone has different roles, capacities, depending on their organizations, again, depending on their interests. And so we need to understand, Dustin Johnson and I say this a lot, how do we mix and match our respective tools that we all have in this space to achieve these collective outcomes? And so Autumn and others up here are going to share one example of how we've been doing this work in Harney County.
Thank you. So my name is Autumn Muir, and I wear a lot of different hats like most of us here. Today, I'm representing the Harney County Wildfire Collaborative. I'm the Stinking Waters Facilitator. But in a previous life, I was a wildlife biologist for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and that's how I was engaged with the Harney County Wildfire Collaborative back in the day. So basically, in just a few years, from 2012 to 2014, over 1.5 million acres of sagebrush steppe burned in just Harney County alone. So this kind of inspired local folks to form the Harney County Wildfire Collaborative. This was formed in 2014. And the main purpose was reducing the potential for and the impact of megafires in Harney County. Now, for those of you, just as a reminder, a megafire, the definition of that is anything that's over 100,000 acres. And this is a new term, or it was back then. So that's why we had to come together with some new tools. So we identified 3 focal issues: suppression, prevention, and restoration. So step 1, we really drilled in on the fire suppression, because at that time in Harney County, there were very strained relationships between the federal agencies and the local RFPAs. So to build those relationships, we identified that we needed to create a cohesive firefighting resource. So to do that, we reviewed all of the fire history in Harney County. We shared the knowledge of the current conditions. We clarified and refined a memorandum of understanding that already existed. And then we developed really creative ways to share training, communication tools, equipment, and protocols. And that sounds super easy, but that took like 2.5 years. So just to put it in perspective, but it resulted in these really new or renewed positive relationships, and it built that baseline of trust. So this enabled the feds and the RFPA resources to work together on, new fires, or then, because there's always new fires. And it also allowed us to create an RFPA liaison position within the Burns Interagency Fire Zone. So that was a really big success for us. So we moved on to step 2, which was prevention. And it just so happened at that time, there were all these changes to the national policy direction, which created, objectives for pilot projects within the Great Basin. Perfect. So we identified a pilot project area, and our goals for this were to protect the best of the best, to protect areas with the highest risk to megafires, to protect areas where there was the highest potential for ecological uplift, and areas where there's already been substantial investment in restoration. And so we took all these criteria, and we, at that time, used the best available science and mapping tools that we had. Wish we would have had these tools back then. But we looked at fuel accumulation, probability of burning, the time since the last fire, presence of annual grasses, the ability to manage for sage grouse, viability of the site, available infrastructure like roads, and I say usable roads, because not all roads are created equally in Harney County, willingness of permittees to participate, cost benefit rest, etc. So we selected the Pueblo Mountain area, which is in the, it would be the southwest portion of Harney County. And the Pueblo subcommittee was formed in May of 2016. So that subcommittee took on a whole another host of delineating this large, it was like 219,000 acres. That's still too big. So we went down to subunits. We identified all the values and threats and resources and developed a pilot project prevention plan. And our goals with that were to improve response time, road access, road improvement, early detection cameras, water development opportunities. And then we used every tool that we thought might work: outcome-based grazing, brush mowing, prescribed fire, herbicide, seeding. And we wrote a Pueblo Mountain Project EA because it was in wilderness study areas. So we did a lot of first-time things. And, you know, it's been implemented. We're now in the monitoring and adaptive management phase. And then next we moved on to step 3, which was restoration. But I'm gonna make you wait. And I'm gonna tell you about that later. So here's Dustin.
We're good. Okay. So morning, everyone. I'm Dustin Johnson. I'm the Rangeland Outreach Specialist with Oregon State University and the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center. And in my first part with you this morning, I'm going to be largely revisiting some crap that Chad Boyd and I presented last year. And those of you who are part of last year's summit, you may get that inside joke, which a few of you laughed. So I appreciate that. So I'm going to do it from a slightly different perspective, though. And as I think Katie had described very well, effective landscape scale conservation and management requires some level of coordination and collaboration among affected stakeholders in these mixed ownership geographies. But I think it's important for us to recognize that collaboration doesn't just happen magically, right? It doesn't start happening just out of the blue. And not every geography that is important from a core rangeland standpoint or a sage grouse habitat standpoint is immediately ripe for effective collaboration. And so I think it's important for us to think about like what needs to be in place in order for that would enable effective collaboration. And so antecedents or enabling conditions that are widely recognized as essential drivers and maybe more so sort of foundational elements for effective collaboration include elements, and these should sound somewhat familiar, but of a common crisis or some sort of focusing event or events that kind of motivate the collaboration. A shared vision should sound familiar, should have opportunity for mutual benefit for the affected stakeholders. And then something we heard early and often yesterday is, capacity for local leadership. And so these preconditions or enabling conditions, it really indicate how likely it is that a group or a community will actively and successfully engage in a high functioning partnership. And so the main reason to mention these enabling conditions for effective collaboration is to make the point that if they're lacking, it can mean one of two things. One is that the crisis or the problem that you're trying to address really doesn't lend itself well to collaborative solutions. And I know Brenda Smith in her opening remarks yesterday morning, her welcoming remarks, very accurately made the point that collaboration doesn't work in every situation. And I think I couldn't agree more with that sentiment. The other option is that if these conditions are lacking, then it possibly means you have a different starting point in that collaborative process, whereby you really need to secure those conditions before you can make progress moving forward. And so I just wanted to touch a little more in detail on each one of these. And I think that most of us in this room can appreciate that people really need to be motivated to work together. It's not something that necessarily happens naturally. And I think this might be especially true for rural areas where the ability to make decisions and to operate independently is kind of an essential way of life. And, things are so spread out, communities are so spread out. And I think we carry that mindset into how we approach problems. And so as it turns out, a crisis or, a broad scale problem can be a pretty strong motivating factor in getting people to work together. And especially when, that crisis has, these broad scale cross-cutting ecological, economic, and social impacts for communities. And I certainly think that the interactive forces of wildfire and invasive annual grasses fit that description. So I think maybe we have the crisis part covered here, unfortunately. So I think effective collaboration also requires that everyone that's being impacted by the crisis understand the problem in a similar way, which is really foundational for establishing a common vision for how to go about addressing that problem. And I think establishing the ability to establish a common vision is really predicated on existing relationships and the trust that goes along with that. So the point I'm trying to make here is if there aren't existing networks in that geography that you want to focus in, they need to be built. And as Autumn just mentioned, it can take years to do that piece of it. So that's kind of a reality check on that piece. But another important aspect is that the options that are available for addressing the crisis or the problem need to generate some kind of mutual benefit among the affected stakeholders. And I would argue, otherwise, if there's no benefit in participating, why would you participate, right? So, and I would argue that those benefits don't necessarily need to be spread equally across all the stakeholders. But what I would say is that if the option or options for addressing a problem sort of categorically create winners and losers, then collaboration probably isn't the right approach for dealing with that issue. So lastly, and this is really important, and it gets to this capacity topic that we were talking about yesterday, but capacity to provide local leadership is essential in enabling effective collaboration. And so these local leaders are really the energy centers that are concerned more about stewarding the process than they are about steering the process towards a particular outcome or set of outcomes. And in our case, with the Wildfire Collaborative, we've been supported by the High Desert Partnership, and they've been playing that role. And I can't stress the importance of an individual or organization providing that sort of coordination capacity to support these processes. And it's absolutely essential. So I think I'll end there, and I'll pass it back to Autumn, who will talk about a geography that was right for the Wildfire Collaborative to work within, and a bit about why the collaborative needed to focus in a particular area. Does that seem fair, Autumn?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Such great partners. Yeah, this is a really good setup for, the next phase. Uh-oh, can you hear me? Okay. This way. Yes, okay, I'm not going to move for the rest of the day. Okay, so why the stinking waters? So again, now we're 4 years into our collaborative. We've had a couple of successes. We're feeling pretty good about ourselves. We're getting some good reputation, some good word of mouth. And so let's move into the next focal issue, which is restoration. So we need to select a new pilot project area. 7 years go by. No, I'm just kidding. It was a really long process. Lots of maps, lots of identifying of threats and issues and ownership. And so anyway, we really wanted to focus on restoration in this phase. And so we were trying to select an already imperiled site. So the Stinking Waters was selected as the next pilot project area. And this was because it really did have that diverse ownership. So we had private, public, federal, state, tribal. It was just everything in there, which meant we could engage new stakeholders, which is something that we wanted to grow our program. And we wanted to test out more tools and techniques to combat, the devastating effects of mega fires. And this area had burned multiple times. So, it was already kind of on everyone's radar that there's a problem here, and what are we going to do to fix it, I guess. And we also saw that there was a potential for multiple projects to occur simultaneously with all of these different partners. It wasn't like we had never looked here before or worked here. NRCS was working there, the County Weed Board, ODFW, the private landowners, of course, were investing tons of their own money. So the Stinking Water Subcommittee was formed in October of 2018. And we decided that, you know, after we identified this stinking waters area, which was again still huge, it was like 370 or 350,000 acres. You're going to talk about it. Okay, I'm not trying to steal your thunder. So, but anyway, it's big and we needed to narrow it down. So I'm just going to stay in the broad pieces, which were, we focused first on community outreach. We identified our landowners in this landscape, the permittees, the community members, and went forward on building these positive working relationships within the boundaries of this geographic area. And we did that using existing relationships. Our range cons already have great relationships with a lot of the ranchers. So we did a lot of one-on-one meetings. We had some workshops. We sent out lots of newsletters, and then we also attended the RFPA meetings because they're already getting together. So we integrated all those comments and concerns from those preliminary community contacts and developed recommendations. So this is how the subcommittee, you know, goes out, kind of does the legwork, and then brings it back to the larger wildfire group. And then we of course, just like everything else, focus on the low hanging fruit, you know, the invasive annual grass infestations in the low elevation, the heavy fuel loading in the higher elevation with junipers, targeted grazing for fuel treatments, water developments or water improvements to help move cattle strategically, and also to help with those transition years. If we're talking about treating all these landscapes, well, the cows need to go somewhere else while those fields are being rested. So we continue to build upon the existing work and maintain success that had already occurred. And these activities and communications and efforts continued for a few years. And then this new available science kind of triggered a new discussion about PCLs and pods, and I won't talk about it, but potential control lines and potential operational delineations. And then, so that's giving us new fuel to the fire, no pun intended. And then the Senate Bill 762 funding comes along, and we form the SOUR subcommittee. In January of 2022, we apply for that grant. We're successful with a $5 million award. And so we start working with partners and contractors to, you know, lay out these herbicide treatments and spray and juniper reduction. And so basically we're continuing to test theories and real on the ground actions on these smaller pilot project areas. And the hope is that we can take what works or learn what doesn't work and expand that and replicate it across not only all of Harney County, but maybe, you know, I'll just say and beyond. So I just, I think I'll close with that. We're going to get into a lot more details, but I would say our diverse group of that has this incredible body of knowledge and skills and abilities is truly what makes this possible. And it's not just the scientists, it's literally integrating all of the people that this impacts. And I think the landowners and the ranchers and our community members are integral to that. And we could not have made this happen if we hadn't built that trust. So you've got to take the time and put that in, because if we would have just started with this, I don't think that we would have been successful.
Yeah. Great, thank you, Autumn. So I have the fun job of taking a lot of what Autumn said and showing it to you visually. So we like a little bit of redundancy here, right? And so I'm just going to walk you through several maps that are different layers available in the landscape planning tool, which is something we're going to actively jump into using when we go over to our next venue. So do not be tempted to leave when we switch venues. We want you to continue this conversation. But because this is kind of our example, Autumn did a great job of explaining how we went from Harney County to the Stinking Waters area. I'm now really just going to walk through visually what that looks like. Mentioned large area, about 330,000 acres. You can just see what it looks like here on this map. That is still an enormous pilot area to contend with. And so as Autumn also mentioned, this is this was intentional for you to set this up. We want a little redundancy, right? And so now you can see exactly what she was talking about. We have such a complexity of land managers. So there's federal, state, tribal. When you see all of that white in there, we have over 400 different private parcels as well. And so that is so many different owners, different permittees, picked a really complicated place to work, right? And if you dive into just one of those landowners, BLM, it's not any more simple. We have incredible complexity in the management there as well. So you can see these are the grazing allotments and the BLM pastures. It's just totally complex. So this slide just shows you, hey, good news. We like RFPAs. There is a layer that on the landscape planning tool that shows which areas are covered by RFPAs. It's pretty cool that where we are, most of that area is covered. So those hashed lines just means, yay, RFPA. I'm a big fan. So we also, you've heard many times today already, these are the fire perimeter layers. Talk about a history of fire. So this is all the way up through 2020, all of that red hashing overlaid there. You can see we've just had continual fire in the area. And so what that means is that has implications for ecological threats, which is exactly what the Wildfire Collaborative is focused on. So all these maps that you've seen now, layer after layer, we haven't even mentioned ecological threats. So this is in the landscape planning tool. This is a map of the different cover density, cover percentage of annual grasses and annual forbs. So it's kind of a proxy for invasive annual grasses, but it does include those other annuals. Yellow being the lightest, red being the darkest. There's quite a gradient across this landscape. We've talked about other threats today as well, specifically in terms of conifers, primarily juniper. So in the landscape planning tool, there's also a layer for tree cover. That's what you're seeing here. So the light colors, fewer trees, dark, more trees. You can see in those burned areas, there aren't as many trees, but to the west side, there is quite a bit of juniper. And so juniper has expanded across this landscape in varying levels and does have varying cover. So it's not all bad out there. So it's a good place to work because we also have really good ecological conditions. And you can take a look at this in the landscape planning tool by looking at the perennials. And so this is green layer is of the perennials, it's the forbs and the grasses, the good stuff. The darker the green, the better that we have. We have a lot of green out there still too. Okay, so I apologize. It happens that my outline is the exact color of the shrub layer. But we do have shrubs out there, so that's good news. And this is shrubs. So primarily we're more focused on sagebrush, but this layer does include those other shrubs as well. Turns out, especially in the areas that maybe haven't burned, there are still a lot of shrubs out there on the landscape. Okay, so all of those biotic layers, those combine. This may or may not look familiar. Hopefully it's starting to look familiar to you because all of these combine into the ecostates that Megan's talked about, and we're going to talk about a few more times throughout the day. And so when we think about, we've talked a little bit about the, and we will more resistance for abiotic. Well, when you're thinking about vegetative communities, you can think about biotic resistance. And here, when we have those really good intact sagebrush rangelands, those kind of good green, maybe some blue colors, we're going to think of more high biotic R&R. So we'll dive more into this later. But as I mentioned, you have the biotic side for resistance and resilience, but you definitely have the abiotic side as well. And if that's not familiar to you, so here's a map of it. That red is going to be low abiotic resistance and resilience. So if you think of areas that are maybe south-facing slopes, low precipitation regimes, so just really hot and dry, areas that it's very difficult to restore. Those are going to be your low R&R. Then you have your blue, which are areas of higher R&R. You're much more likely to be successful. Maybe we want to focus in those areas because we don't want to just throw seed on the ground that might not end up in restoration events. So yeah, this further complicates the biotic. Okay, so all of this complexity, and we haven't actually even talked about other values. There is a wide breadth of different values in this area as well. So for example, sage grouse, right? Haven't even touched on that yet. This is kind of meant to be an overwhelmingly looking layer. So I'm just layering all of these things on top of each other. And I do want to mention, because I think there could have been some confusion earlier throughout the day. We've talked a lot about core. Megan calls it big C core. That's great. We're talking about kind of the sagebrush ecosystem. Sometimes people talk about core for sage grouse. We're not talking about core for sage grouse. When we say pack, that's when I mean sage grouse. And so that's what this is here. Those red, you can kind of see faint red outlines for the sage grouse priority areas for conservation. So that might be something that we need to consider in this landscape as well. And then kind of the gray hash is sage grouse low density habitat. So it's really important to think about grouse and other wildlife and how they might, their spatial footprints might also vary across these landscapes. Okay, all of that to say, that's a lot of layers. Landscape planning tool has a lot of really good, helpful information, but there are many values that we can't even map. And we shouldn't just throw those out and not even consider them because they're not in the tool. We definitely want to think about and talk about those non-mappable values, because that might direct where we work or where we don't work. And so here's just a word cloud that folks with the Wildfire Collaborative did in this area. So you can see different words that are popping out that are valuable. And so at this point, I really hope everyone is thoroughly overwhelmed, because that was kind of my intention by layering all of these maps, all of these values, everything that's going on. So what I want to point out is that we do have a lot to consider across our landscape. And we often can end up completely paralyzed really by the complexity and the size, and we just don't know where to start. So we need to break this landscape up. It's large, over 330,000 acres. Did a great job of narrowing down Harney County, right? But we still have this huge area to contend with, and we need to start prioritizing. So I'm going to pass that off. Oh, I forgot to introduce myself again. For those of you who didn't catch me yesterday, I'm Vanessa Schrader. I work for Oregon State University's Extension Service as a senior faculty research assistant. Flip the script.
So Vanessa did a super job introducing the area, emphasizing the complexity, but also just the sheer vastness of this area. And so, as I said earlier, we can't treat everything everywhere. And so the Wildfire Collaborative has focused on promoting values at risk from frequent and severe fires. And so to do this, there's a recognition that we need to strategically manage fire. We're not going to stop fires, but we can influence how frequent they are and also the outcomes of those fires after they burn. And so fire management is critical to preventing the spread of invasive annual grasses. Likewise, as we all know, the spread of invasive annual grasses is influenced by fire. And so for us, rangeland management is fire management. And so we need a way to deploy the right tools in the right places at the right scale. Some places need fire, some places do not need more fire. And so how do we meaningfully do those things? Go ahead. And so we recognize that there was a need for a framework to accommodate all those different needs, the values that we've heard about today on this landscape. And so potential operational delineations are a tool to do this. But first, I'm going to hand it off to Casey to tell us a little more.
Thank you. Casey O'Connor. I'm an AFMO within the Burns Interagency Fire Organization. Operations is one of my positions, as well as the RFP liaison that Autumn hit on earlier with the cohesive fire fighting strategy that was identified early on in our collaborative. How many of you are making a little more interactive, familiar with these acronyms, pods, PCLs, little exposure? And I think it's growing, especially if you guys sit in a line officer seat. If you're involved with WFDS, it's becoming a lot more utilized in the fire world. and the interface between the line officer and the fire group. So starting out with these acronyms, going over the PCL piece. This, I was first exposed, Forest Service exercise. That's where it largely stemmed from. If any of you know in the planner world, Rick Stratton, he pushed it hard when he was in this region. And then it kind of carried on and grew from there. And at first, you know, it's a old concept, new acronym is the way I looked at it. But the more I've been exposed to it, used it, looked at it from different lens when I go elsewhere with incident management teams. I see a lot more utility going forward with it. Within this landscape, those potential control locations were initially, you know, those are the lines that define those polygons, and that's identifying the right roads, rivers, ridges, those features that you're going to be able to utilize on in the fire world to make a stand if you do have a going fire on a bad fire day. Having these PCLs identified, I mean, the first step, it takes some of the emergency out of the emergency, because we already kind of have a plan. We kind of have the infrastructure identified on the landscape. And that's not just within my fire group and the federal side, but also when I'm interfacing with the RFPAs. We're looking at the same map, same roads. And as we'll talk to here in a bit, it's been a collaborative joint effort in identifying these. And that's the first cut of it. I pass it back to you then for the set.
It's like putting on a play. Yeah, and so in short, potential control lines, the idea is for safe, efficient fire response. Improved fire response means that we can protect these values at risk and also our investments. But all these lines, you can see them in black here on the map. That's really overwhelming. And then also it's very likely not socially acceptable to have a fire break on every single, you know, foot of line we have sketched here. That's completely unreasonable, and it kind of goes against, you know, principles for landscape connectivity. And so how do we prioritize these lines? Again, we can't treat everything everywhere. So the Wildfire Collaborative's priority, again, limit invasive annual grasses and large wildfires. And so potential control lines, PCLs, are a piece of a broader strategy that relies on pods, which are the potential operational delineations. I'll let our fire guy explain them.
Thank you. So going into the pods, the framework behind this, and that's what it is in my mind. The more I've been exposed to it, used it from different perspectives, is it is a strategic framework to break up a landscape, or as Chad Boyd would say, a way to eat the elephant. It gives you some structure. It gives you a way to unravel a complex landscape, like, you know, Vanessa was hitting on, and it's a starting point. It treats the landscape with fire in mind, which is a positive change in my mind. You know, a lot of times before, I used to sit on the resource side, and fire is this big emergency, but it's going to happen. It's going to happen again. And kind of my mantra is, it's all going to burn. It's just under what conditions, how prepared are we going to be when it does go? So it's treating it more like a fire shed. Some of these terms are already tagged and tied to other, but it's treating like a fire shed, a fire pasture, breaking it up into these polygons, based on the fire management input, as far as, you know, where could we actually stop a fire at. Initially it was, you know, more in a timbered environment, and that's been the big challenge with kind of getting it adopted into the rangelands, is how do we utilize it? Because it was used more in the timber as far as, you know, where's benefit versus not benefit, and kind of a comparison there. Whereas we're looking at these landscapes, they're fragile, they're delicate, and when they burn, it's more like, how bad is it? It gives you really the end state. And Ian Rickert, he's a regional planner in this area, and he's doing a great job picking up where Rick left off. And he put out kind of a communication tool on this to try to, you know, he's making the push to get it more across our region, and it is our currency, or how we communicate within the IMT world and then the local land manager state is building the pods is a collaborative process. And that's the way to look at it, to adapt it into this environment. It's a strategic framework to prioritize stuff, not only on the preventative and the preparedness side, as far as having a pre-plan where we go, you know, where we focus to make a stop if we have a fire moving. It gives you response. I mean, we utilize maps that have these lines on them to give everyone the same, you know, they're on the same page. And then going down forward, if we do have a fire, it also helps frame up the restoration process and work on improving resilience on the landscape overall.
Thanks, Casey. And so in short, pods, so each of those units that are outlined by these PCLs, they're a tool to conceptually compartmentalize this landscape. And so they can be used for fire response. So as Casey said, you know, getting resources out there, is fire beneficial in some of these pods? If yes, our fire responders would know about that in advance and allow a fire to perhaps burn in one of those pods. Their pods are useful for fire preparedness and risk management. Where are our fuels accumulated on this landscape? Where can we be most effective in treating those fuels? And then as Casey also said, post-fire, where should we invest? Where would we make most, the biggest difference in terms of fire at the landscape scale? So this entire project area, is there one pod that has an outsized influence on the occurrence and outcomes of fire than another? And so the idea of pods and this pilot project in the Stinky Waters area is to ascertain that all activities before, during, and after fires are synergistic. They work together and collectively they improve fire outcomes. So what happens after that fire? And also long-term ecosystem resilience. And so rather than focusing the Wildfire Collaborative on a single aspect of fire, which Autumn had said initially, prevention, suppression, restoration, thanks everyone. We're thinking of managing fire more holistically through those three phases. We're integrating fire management. And so pods are a tool to guide all of our activities to ensure that, again, they're in service of the Wildfire Collaborative's broader goal, which is to promote those values at risk of frequent fires.
Okay, now we're going to go into how we develop pods across this landscape, or starting with the potential control locations. This took longer than I thought it would. It seemed like a very simple process. But to get everyone involved, it took a while just to, I don't want to use, I was going to say light the fire. I don't want to say that. To get people going, to get the, get everyone on board and push forward. Because at first we just tried a blank map, got it out to the RFPA, the Crane RFPA group. I think people are apprehensive to mark it up until somebody, you know, breaks the seal on it. So then took a different approach, and I worked with one of the range cons that knew the area very well and worked with, you know, he'd been in that area, it was Travis Hatley. We went over it, we just got a map, doodled on it, got it all marked up. And then we started with that. And it was supported by the Crane RFPA. They endorsed the whole overall concept. They saw the value in what we were doing. And largely that's from their past emergency, which was the Buzzard fire. And just how things went south on that. And a lot of that had to do with people not being on the same page. And where that typically happens is when we bring a IMT, outside group of firefighters into this area, and they spend a couple days trying to figure out which way's north. They're trying to scout the land, figure out what roads they want to use, what their box is. And so from the local perspective, seeing that kind of effort when you bring in an IMT, it doesn't sit well. People have a hard time communicating with they're just like, ugh. So that was recognized and understood by the RFPA, that, the private end holders on there, as far as the value of having this up front and having a common operating picture, so to speak, across this landscape. And so we took these maps initially, brought it to them, and then we started to see, after getting support with RFPA, we started to see a lot more input coming from the landowners and people out in the area.
Oh, Casey queued that up. Great for me. Josh Hansen, I coordinate the Wildfire Collaborative and going off of what Casey said there, when he presented it to the RFPs, there was support there. But they also did say, we'll talk to our land ownership, but we're not going to talk for every landowner in there. And also coming back to, this took a little bit longer than we expected. One of the landowners that showed up, they voiced, hey, you guys have been having this conversation for a while. What do you have to show for it? And then that led into where Casey and Travis kind of jotted these lines down on the map. And that landowner was great because she said, hey, you can get more input. Like I'll bring a meeting together and I'll call my neighbors and stuff. So we rolled with that. And again, reiterating, this is a large landscape. So following with that, that top black line is Highway 20. And so Burns is on the west side and Gentura is kind of on the northeast of that map. So we met with the northern landowners to basically coffee and draw on a map. And that's what we showed up with. We showed up with these lines because that's what Casey and Travis developed, and they used a lot of great tools and their knowledge to do that. But we also understand the landowners have so much more knowledge about what those roads will look like. And as Autumn mentioned, not all roads are created equally. We found that out at the Gentura meeting when somebody pointed to a line and said, hey, there's a spring there. And if you bring any truck by there, it'll get stuck. We're like, oh, okay. So we should redraw that line. And he goes, yeah. We're like, okay, well, where would you redraw? And it did take a little while to get that buy-in and to get them to start drawing on a map. But when they bought into it and they started going, it was good to get the lines readjusted, because then those landowners, I mean, we just can't get that knowledge from having a meeting in town. And we really appreciate the landowners that come consistently to the meetings, but we also understand that they can't come to every meeting. They have their lives too on the ranches. And we felt like this draft map was at a good stage to not have them try and produce the lines, but bring a product to them, and not in the final stage either, saying, hey, this is our map. You good with it? Okay, see you later. But hey, this is our map. This is what we think could be good. What do you think? And can you please give us your input? Because this is going to drive wildfire fighter response. And when we went to those meetings, I like to say, if it's more than a pickup full, we're bringing too many people. If we can't all fit in a pickup, that was too many people. So we narrowed it down to ARS, OSU scientists, BLM Fuels, and Natural Resources. And I think that was great that those two teamed up together to draw these lines, because they have a different perspective, but they're both so valuable to this landscape. And they both bring their own knowledge and viewpoint to be able to get these lines on a map. So we went up, did a meeting in Gentura, met with the north landowners, and then we went down to Crane, more on the southwest side, and had another meeting there at the RFPA building, and a different group of landowners came, and yeah, that's how we got more of these lines on the map.
So now we've got lines on a map. I'm sorry, introduce myself. Kaylee Littlefield with High Desert Partnership. I'm the community involvement and monitoring coordinator. So yesterday I talked about our monitoring program and what we got going and stuff. And so this year we went through the whole process of, we got lines on a map, we've got a crew together, let's go out and monitor. So we went out and monitored, and this is so far what we have. We started early summer. We took a break when the fire hazard got too high to be driving pickups around. And then this fall, we kept going. And we were looking for areas of vegetation changes. We're using the Scottenbergen model. If you're familiar with it, great. I'm not super familiar with it. Casey is. But there's 40 models to take a picture of landscape and say, okay, this picture will fit this model, and this is how the fire will behave along this area. So by inventorying that on these lines, it helps Casey and other scientists go, okay, we've got pinch points here where a fire is not gonna be good to be held. We've got road conditions where we can't get equipment down. We've got, gray area where there's already a fire break because a fire already went through there and took everything out. And so just kind of getting that information down on a map of what's going on. And if you guys want to repeat this, I strongly suggest getting a technician who's been in fire, because my technician who has been helping me with this has been an invaluable resource to me. We'll be driving down a road and she goes, there's no way they can get a big boy down here. There's no way they can do this. Oh, I wouldn't want to fight a fire here. And so having that information is huge on that. So kind of an overview of how different this area is. For those of you who are colorblind, I'm very sorry, but the purple means that it's a shrub type of fuel model. The green, it's a shrub grass, brown trees, so mostly juniper in this area. And then yellow was straight grass on there. So you can kind of see a trend as we moved across. And go ahead, next slide. So kind of narrowing in down on a spot, and how we did this is we just got out when there was a vegetation change. The pickup took pictures on the sides of the road to show that vegetation change. We used a Robel pole to show heights of the vegetation, kind of give an overview of what's going on, and then put it down on a map so we can start using that information. Currently, right now, we're still gathering data, so next steps are to come.
We'd like to pause for a quick second and ask the audience if there's any questions for anybody not holding a mic right now. How do you want to do this, Megan? I have one.
I'm curious to know, when you were setting this up, did you look at all the sage grouse leks and all the known nesting areas and try and integrate that into your plans? And if so, did you do treatments near there, or did you try and keep treatments away from those? What was your thinking there?
Here, Autumn, let me bring this to you. Best way to get out of questions.
Yes, so at that time, I was the wildlife biologist for Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and so I had all of those layers, all of that information. And so, and I would just add that we also looked at mule deer winter range, pronghorn migration corridors. There are a lot more layers that we didn't talk about in the essence of time, but we did prioritize some of those nesting areas for treatments, the lek sites, anything within 4 miles of the lek, to enhance, get rid of perching structures with the juniper. So yes, they were identified and prioritized, although then it still relies on the coordination and agreement of the landowner to then want to do that. But we identified them and lay them out in a plan. And some places it happened, and some places it's yet to still happen.
So other than cutting juniper, what other treatments did you do? You guys my question.
Yeah, so and largely, we're still at the inventory. Oh, repeat the question. Other than cutting juniper, what other treatments have we engaged in? And I think right now, we're still kind of looking at how we're gonna eat this elephant. We're getting inventory with Kaylee's work. And we're looking at what tools fit the need in what area. And we had a field trip this summer, I guess. That a lot of this stuff was identified, a lot of annual grass treatments with herbicide in the area tied to the past fire history in there, and a very healthy population of medusa head. So juniper cutting on those maps, and they're looking at the higher elevation, more resistant, resilient sites, be a big portion of treatment. Potentially brush beating would be a treatment that we would propose, as well as utilizing other more unorthodox, like using grazing as a tool to reduce the fine fuels. And there was some pretty cool stuff showcased at that field trip with using collars that other people here can talk a lot better on than I can.
And I'll also add, so as we mentioned, there's an awful lot of federal land in this area. And so one of the next hurdles, challenges, opportunities. So we need the information Kaylee's group is collecting just to understand the condition along those PCLs. Then we need to figure out, is there existing NEPA for fuel treatments that would be appropriate for those really concerning priority areas? If there isn't, how do we make that happen? If it's private land, we need landowners on board. We perhaps need support from NRCS. And so there's a lot of, not only is it identifying the actual treatments, but identifying the authorities that either we currently have or will need in order to do this in a way that would, prioritize those values, but also achieve those outcomes we're seeking through those treatments.
Do you have any other questions? I can bring the mic around if there are folks in the back of the room.
And while you're thinking of your question, I'll just add one more thing. So I would say that it's important to remember that this is not the first effort in this area. So it's been identified by the BLM, it's been identified by NRCS, ODFW has their wildlife area out there, Riverside. So there has been work and those layers, specifically sage grouse, of course, identified. And now we're just kind of taking an overarching approach to the larger and trying to integrate and maintain and build upon the successes that have already occurred.
Yeah, and Kevin's got a question online too.
Yeah, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Emily can read that out for us. It looks like I've got a question from Stacy here. What invasive prevention measure does Harney County Wildfire Collaborative implement? Weed wash stations, vehicle and equipment cleaning prior to dispatching to a fire, or washing vehicle equipment after leaving an infested area are examples.
That's a good one. No, those are standard operating procedures for us with regards to weeds, since we do have known populations and stuff. So if it's an extended attack deal, we're always trying to get a weed wash station on site. If it's just standard IA and it's not logistically possible to get that out there, there's, protocol washing off, cleaning your engines off before you leave or go to a new incident. When they get back to town, they get a more thorough wash. So yeah, definitely, because that is a vector I'm aware of. I've seen it.
I'll also add that might be an interesting opportunity for the Wildfire Collaborative to engage the public more broadly about this project and about, these roadways, even if they're just 2 tracks. We know people like to go play in the Stinky Water Mountains. And so this might be an outreach opportunity to make sure we all understand that these roads are vectors for the spread of invasives. It's maybe something we want to take on in the future.
Yeah, and I just want to make it clear that the Wildfire Collaborative doesn't implement management, right? So we're bringing a group together to talk about what might make sense in that landscape and, about these frameworks and that sort of thing. But ultimately, it's the land managers like BLM and the private landowners that are making decisions about how they're going to manage their land. And so I just want to make that absolutely clear that this is a forum to talk about kind of at that landscape scale, what might make sense and relative to reducing the impacts and incidents and impacts of large scale wildfire. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can move too. My legs work. Yeah, my quick question for you is when I look at the map that you show, I know it's a big area. This still looks like a lot of lines and a lot of pods, and this is a lot of data to carry out on each road. And I'm wondering if you have an early reflection on if this is the right density of pods for this landscape. If you think actually you wish there were more, if there were more control lines that you could put in, or if you could do it again or going forward, you would start, every othering it. Thinking about especially how this would scale for landscapes beyond this pilot project.
First off, thank you, Matt, for the question, because you all will be faced with making those kinds of decisions in the workshop in a little bit.
Yeah, to hit on that, I don't want to steal anyone's thunder coming up here, but that's a question that's been in my mind when we're looking at this. I mean, we mark it up and then what's sustainable and what can we actually take on, and with all the challenges. I mean, some of this been brought up yesterday for this week, on our contractors, NEPA and clearances and all these things. So there, the next step that we've taken is looking at how do we prioritize across this with those lines that have been identified.
And one other thing, and I might put Dustin on the spot, one question that we struggle with is how is this approach exportable? It's not reasonable to drive every single road in Harney County. And so that's the next long-term step.
That about covers it. No, yeah, it is important, you know, because what we're trying to do in the stinking waters is develop a process and a model that we can export to the rest of Harney County and perhaps beyond. And so we need to be mindful of what we do there we need to be able to replicate that. And so it involves what Casey talked about in terms of prioritizing. You know, we can go through this initial process, identifying, you know, largely via roads and ridges and rivers, as Casey put it. That's our first cut, but then, you know, we need to think about what that means relative, and I'll get into this actually. I think, yeah, I don't want to spoil what we're going to do later, but we need to see how that fits with, you know, landscape conditions in terms of what ecology is happening and that sort of thing. And I think we also need to think about how we better integrate some of our new technologies in that process. And I don't see driving the thousands of miles of roads in Harney County alone as being sustainable. So I think there's some things we can think about in terms of technology and maybe getting Megan's help with that. So probably should shift to Chad, I'm guessing. Okay, we're going to try putting Chad on, who's this little round speaker right now.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right, can you hear me?
There we go. Yes.
And I'm going to suggest that we try to land the space shuttle after this. I've got this conversation, my phone, Vanessa's phone, a microphone, my Bluetooth, and my computer. So what you're doing. I'm going to have a couple of go backs here, and to the moderators, I will get through in time with what I'm supposed to talk about. But a couple of go backs. Kevin asked a question kind of about larger buy-in. It's in the chat on the pods and PCLs. And from what I've seen, it's there. I really think it is. What pods and PCLs are doing in the stinking waters is it's creating a common spatial vocabulary, fire and fuels management. And what I'm seeing resource people and operations people within agency talking to each other. That doesn't always happen because we got that common vocabulary that we can use for fire and fuels. We can also use pods from a restoration standpoint, right? Or a prevention standpoint. We'll talk about that. We've also got a vocabulary of fire and fuels management because the maps that you see of pods and PCLs are in every RFPA truck. They're in every interagency truck. So everybody has the same playbook, right? It's like we put a game plan together before the football game as opposed to putting a game plan together as the football game's unfolding. And if teams ever get called in, and Casey talked about this, that's a big deal. There have been some train wrecks in the past when teams get called in, and it's not because the teams aren't doing a good job. It's because there's a lack of communication between people on the ground and people who have on the ground knowledge in the teams. Well, these pods and PCLs are something that could be emailed to teams that are en route to where everyone instant common spatial vocabulary of fire and fuels management. So yeah, I've been actually surprised at how it's taken off, and it really back to a lot of the groundwork that BLM and others like Hydrogen Partnership have laid in the relationships that allowed them to be a common vocabulary. You know, BLM's got they've got a liaison position between the interagency teams and the RFPAs. They value that. And that relationship has totally flipped in the last 10 years, really since that position has been created. And so I think that's why there's a common vocabulary. It starts with relationships, then it that the relationship allow cool products like PCLs and pods to take hold and be operationalized. So I just wanted to go back on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start narrowing down focus here. I've got 4 slides, and I want to talk about a goal of ours. And goals are really important because you've heard a lot about a considerable collaborative energy that's in the form of the Harney County Wildfire Cooperative, and it's focused on the spot on planet Earth called the Stinking Water Mountains, 300-acre geography. One of the dangers in that is that we just go out and do a bunch of stuff, right? We got a bunch of type A people in the room, we want to get stuff done, let's just go start stuff. It's not to lead to a good place, and what it leads to is dissatisfaction with the collaborative effort because we really can't put our finger on something that we've actually done. And so one of the things that we've tried to do is to center all of these efforts that you're hearing about today around specific goals. And one of those goals is to prevent the transition, and I will say fire-based transition, to annual grasses. I want to make clear that fire is not a new disturbance in this landscape. These lands, the Stinking Waters, the rest of Southeast Oregon grew up with fire. They evolved with fire. If you think about the Stinking Waters, we probably had fire return intervals before annual grasses, anywhere from as 20 years in some of the upper elevation stuff to probably 100 years plus to some of the lower elevation country in the Stinking Waters. So fire's not a new thing for the Stinking Waters. These plant communities evolved with it. Of course, annual grasses changed everything. And one of the things that they did is to accelerate transition to invasive annual grasses. And so, excuse me, that's something that we want to get out in front of. And I'll tie that back to yesterday and yesterday's discussion of strategic conservation. If the area converts to invasive annual grasses, our probability of restoring it, not great. So really what we want to do is in front of the problem strategically and focus on taking those areas that are still somewhat intact and keeping it, but could potentially transition to annuals with fire and keeping that from happening. So to do that, we need to know something about the biotic as well as the abiotic landscape of the Stinking Water project area. And so we'll look at the biotic first, and someone could change the slide, please. So to get a handle on the biotic resources in the Stinking Waters, we used our upland threat models. And if anybody with those, we call them a 60-mile-an-hour tool. We grouped plant communities into buckets. You can call them states, you can call them buckets, doesn't matter. That can be recognized at highway speeds, okay? So we basically have states, A, B, C, D. And state A is what we want to be. It's strong, safe brush overstory, strong perennial understory. State B is what might happen when state A burns if it doesn't convert to annuals. State B is basically a perennial dominated grassland. Okay, state C is what happens when we have a degraded understory condition. And that means that we still got our sagebrush overstory, but we're missing that perennial understory. And in the Stinking Water, and that can take 2 forms. Number one, don't have anything in the understory. That would be the state C. In the Stinking Waters, what we tend to see is that those areas that are being vacated by perennials are being inhabited by annuals. So what we get is a sagebrush overstory, an annual grass understory in state C. And then state D would be an annual grass plant community. And we also have some conifer states. I'm not really going to talk about those because they're not applicable to this goal. So I really want to focus on A, B, C, D. And what we're really concerned about in the Stinking Waters is this, a couple of things. This A to C transition that you see in the slide, and it means that it's still state A, but we've got an emerging population of annual grasses to the point where if that plant community burns, we're going to have concerns about it transitioning to annuals, right? And why? Because we're going back to previous discussion today, because we don't have the perennials to hold that space. And if what perennial bunch grasses do is basically provide the resistance to annuals. So we're concerned about those plant communities that are going from A to C. We're also very concerned about those that are in state C now. And what that does, that framework does, is to map those conditions and the conditions that we're concerned about kind of across the Stinking Water Project area. Where are those A to C transitions? Where are those state Cs that we're concerned about transitioning to annual grasses? And in the upcoming slide, it's you'll be, well, go to the next slide. Okay, I'm still waiting on it.
Yeah, sorry, Chad,
So
we're
are we,
slightly
Chad.
frozen. There we go. We got it. Hopefully you have it too.
Very cool. So I'm not going to say a lot about this slide. In the previous slide, we talked about kind of the biotic palette. What does it look like for the Stinking Water Project area? And we also need to, if we're going to think about transitioning to annual grasses, it's not just about what's their biotic, that we can think about the biotic resistance in the previous slide. We also need to know something about the abiotic conditions. How warm is it? How dry is it? Because that's going to influence the vulnerability of a given set of biotic conditions to transition to annual grasses. And so we straight up the NRCS updated 2020 layer of R&R. And this is basically a measure of soil temperature and moisture regime at a given site. And we were able to map that across the stinking waters. Those areas in red are areas with low resistance and resilience, yellow, moderate, and the green areas are high. And, you know, it's in R&R, it's a term we use a lot, but you know, when I use it, just to make clear, to me, resilience is how elastic the plant community is if you disturb it. So if it does burn, how likely is it to return the previous plant community composition? And resistance is straight up the resistance to annual grass invasion. So you can think of the red as being those areas that are most vulnerable to transition to annual grasses from an abiotic standpoint. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. So what we did then is we basically, Megan, Megan do things. She overlaid the abiotic and the bio layers that we just talked about. And we categorized that map using a matrix. And that's kind of in the lower left. So what we did, let's just take state A. If we're in state A and we have low R&R there on the left, we said we had medium probability if that area burns transitioning to annual grasses. As R&R increases, our probability of transition to annual grasses goes down. So if we're state A and we're in a high R&R area, we've got pretty low probability of transition to annual grasses if that area will burn. Let's look at another state. Let's look at this A to C trans one that we're worried about. And it's a straight up linear relationship. If you're low R&R and you're A state, we've got that burgeoning population of annuals in the understory. Low R&R, you're probably transition, that's high probability. But then again, the probability of transition goes down as the aquatic R&R increases. And so we use that matrix to create a map. And by the way, the areas that smaller polygons in black, those are sage grouse packs. And the areas that are state D, I believe, Megan, are the gray areas that you see in the image that you have in front of you. Again, tying this back to yesterday's discussion of strategic management, the goal is to prevent transition, but what is that like strategically? Where are the areas on the landscape that we most need to protect? And by looking at the biotic resistance, the biotic condition, the abiotic and resilience, we're able to put this map together that shows exactly where we are concerned about that transition to annual grasses. And I think that's my last slide. And I'm going to hand it over to Dustin, I believe. And Dustin's going to talk about how we take a map like this, take this concept of pods and PCLs and actually put it into something that's operational that we can use on the ground.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts up here. So we only have 98 more slides to go. So thanks for hanging in there with us. No, I'm going to try to put a bow on this and kind of pull some of these things together. So kind of bringing this back to the Stinking Water Project area. Again, we've identified a series of PCLs, potential control locations within this landscape that, as a reminder, represent locations where fire could potentially be suppressed, right? Kind of a simple concept. But these lines are termed, as alluded to earlier, as potential control locations. And that's for a reason. And that is because not all can be used as such in their current condition. Hence what the work Kaylee's doing. So in fact, the majority of these locations will likely need some kind of treatment so they can serve as safe locations to put firefighters and fire suppression equipment. However, there's over 330 miles of PCLs that we've identified in this landscape, and this, I would argue, relatively small project area, given the size of Harney County and beyond. So as such, it's simply just not fiscally or logistically feasible to do all these treatments, and as Katie alluded to, probably not socially acceptable, especially given that we're hoping to export what we do in the stinking waters to the remainder of Harney County. So therefore, we identified a need to further prioritize PCLs within this landscape relative to which might have the biggest impact relative to our goal of preventing the continued expansion of our immediate goal anyway, of limiting the continued expansion of invasive annual grasses in this landscape. What did I do wrong? I guess I'm not qualified to push a button. So we use the likelihood of post-fire transition to annuals information that Chad just described to prioritize PCLs for more intensive assessment, the work Kaylee's doing, and treatment or potential treatment. And so looking at this map of our project area and this information, we can see that there's a pretty distinct separation in the post-fire or probability of post-fire transition to annuals within our project area, where the western portion of our project area has very low likelihood of transition. And compared to the eastern part of our project area, which has very high likelihood of transition. Yeah, can you? Thank you. This is awkward, sorry. We then overlaid this information with our PCLs in the project area to kind of see how everything lined up. Can we push the button again? And what we found is that the north-south running PCL, shown with the thick blue line on this map, roughly separates the area of low probability of transition to annuals from the area of high likelihood of post-fire transition. So in other words, this line, in our view, represents an extremely important location within this landscape to be able to stop a fire, again, relative to our primary immediate goal of limiting the continued expansion of the annuals in this landscape. Okay, so in addition, much of the western portion of our project area is higher elevation. We've already talked about that a little bit. And it's also heavily impacted by juniper, as Vanessa pointed out. So the fact that it is higher elevation, and given the prevalence of juniper in this area, make it likely that a majority of fire starts would happen in that area within this lightning prone landscape. And in addition, windrows data from the Bald Mountain Remote Automated Weather Station that is located within our project area indicate, and local knowledge obviously confirms this too, but the prevailing winds during the actual fire season are predominantly out of the west. So not only is it likely that fire starts are going to occur in that western portion of the project area, but it's likely to it's likely fire would carry eastward into the other portion of the project area that's at high risk of conversion to annuals post-fire. Okay, so coming back to our likelihood of post-fire transition to invasive annual grasses map that Chad talked about. As a reminder, the gray pixels represent areas that have already transitioned to invasive annual grasses, whereas the red pixels indicate areas that are at high risk of transition, but have not yet converted. And then the yellow and green pixels indicate areas that are at moderate to low risk of transition. And so what you'll notice is the polygons or the PCLs that are not PCLs, pods, all these acronyms, pods on the eastern portion of our project area have a lot of red and yellows, right? So linking back to the sagebrush conservation design and defending growing the core concepts, we see these areas as potential for or opportunities for growing the core within this landscape. The key is to keep them from burning again. Hence the prioritization of this PCL we're showing here. So team, that kind of concludes what I had planned to talk about in terms of our project. Does anybody have anything else to add?
Yeah, we'll take
Yeah.
for questions right up.
No. Apparently I covered it all. So
Question. Yes, I'm gonna project for the room, but we have an online question from Kevin Doherty, and he mentioned, I work on an IMT as a liaison officer. How much buy-in do you have from ODF, the sheriff, and BLM? Ultimately, we get our orders from the agency admins and the local sheriffs as a big voice.
We have ODF fire folks in the back if they want to pipe in.
Yeah, I'll start and then, yeah, if ODF, you guys want to chime in on this. My exposure going elsewhere, I grab onto these and these lines, these polygons, they are available currently. There's a dashboard Stratton made called risk management dashboard. I don't know how many people have looked at that, but a ton of tools in there. It's got a lot of products, but that's my starting point. A lot of times the roles I go off are dealing with that interface with the line officer and working with IMT group, like it's a SOPL or doing the modeling piece of it. But you've already got, if it's built right, which is what we're trying to do here in our sandbox, you should already have buy-in, and you should have, you know, like I said, it's a collaborative process is kind of the way Ian's been pitching it when we're building this. So if we're bringing everyone to the table and we're doing these lines right, it should be something that's turnkey when a team shows up on a district that's overwhelmed with a fire. And those discussions, all that involvement of all parties should have occurred before that. Somebody did mention sheriff was one of those. I mean, we keep people aware of it, but I mean, we could do better to message. But I've worked with, the RFPA group, the emergency management out of the county. So, it's how much, but you can't over communicate some of these things.
Jeff, did you want to? Should I hand it to Jeff? Jeff, this is.
Fix my.
Okay, we'll do, I'll go tell him what the question is. No, you gotta.
Correct. So could you repeat the question so Marvin's on the same level I am?
Ultimately, we get our orders from agency admins and the local sheriff has a big voice.
So absolutely right. And part of what we've set up and what we've done with the collaborative over the last number of years is to try to build that buy-in. And to the point where Casey's position and Jason Gear, who was in it before, is when we have IMTs come in, I'm an agency administrator. I'm Jeff Rose, I'm district manager here. I'm an agency administrator on a fire, so I sign the documents. I make sure that we have the RFPs and they actually come into the meetings now, where before they were not included. They're in the meetings with us, they talk to us, we get their input up front. So from the BLM standpoint, BLM Burns District employees, raise your hand. So I've got that many folks here today off the district. So there's huge buy-in to this. Casey can raise half a hand because we pay half of Casey's salary with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We share Casey. There's enough Casey, almost enough to go around. So, so that's from the BLM standpoint. It's a hugely important.
Marvin, do you want to add a little bit to that? You got to talk to the room and that'll pick you up for the virtual room.
So, well, that was one of the issues identified early on in 14-15 when I got on, is when IMTs come in. And so in the last couple of years, Jacob Gear, who used to be the liaison here in Harney County, Brett Meisinger, who used to be the E-stops, and we kind of put together an integration paper for RFPAs and how to integrate for the BLM for agency administrators. We send that out every spring just as a reminder. We put together a contact book for all the BLM dispatch centers, interagency dispatch centers, with those key RFPA folks with phone numbers and emails. And we actually make contacts with all the county sheriffs, emergency managers. If there's a fire anywhere in Eastern Oregon, there are teams coming in, other than, well, anywhere, I will probably be there. Because I too was on an IMT for 24 years. And I know that integration between outside teams coming in to local folks it can be a tough transition. So I spent way too much time down on Bootleg and Bratton and Lake County. I almost lived in Lake County for the last 3 or 4 years. So I got an address there now. It was so bad, but those components, I know Barry, I say Barry's around here. He knows I show up and I integrate with the county commissioners, emergency manager, sheriff, whatever. So we're here to help those teams be successful with the RFPs.
Sorry. So, and the model has expanded is that there's 2 other liaisons now in the state. 3. So, and Don. Yeah.
So Jason has
You guys got to sit next to each other.
yeah, so I'll move up a little closer. So with the so 2 years ago, Senate Bill 590 passed, which actually added capacity to the rangeland program by adding the croplands as well. So that got the 7th RFPA in Harney County this year with the North Harney, because a big chunk of that was ag land. With that, we got some extra funding. So I have a person out of John Day that oversees Baker, Malheur, Harney County. I have another one in Prineville that oversees Crook, Jefferson, Deschutes, and Lake counties, and another one up in the Dalles that oversees Wasco and across the Columbia Basin, across the north, in the wheatlands. So, and then I got a radio tech I'm hiring on Monday, so I don't have to do that anymore. Yeah. So our program's expanding. There's more folks coming in and to help with that integration with some of the IMTs and the local districts.
So that's just on the suppression side. The stuff these folks are talking about is the investment to help us do better at that, even better at that. So some of the discussions we have over on the hood of a pickup, when there's embers and smoke blowing over everybody, is we've had these discussions already. And we have a better understanding, and because trust me, nothing gets better under stress. And so you want to have these things up front and deal with it.
Nope, don't give it back to Marvin. Do you guys, I don't have an eye on the time. Do you guys want to take a couple more questions from in the room here?
I think we have some time, but I know Autumn wanted to make some comments, I believe, yeah.
Well, I guess first of all, I just want to say thank you guys all so much for listening to us first thing on Thursday morning. And I hear there was a lack in coffee, and I kind of looked out a lot. Oh, I lost my fuzzy. And kind of saw that we were maybe losing some of you guys. And I want to say that the comment that I want to make is that this is a very good analogy to collaboration because it takes a very long time. It's not always the thing that someone's talking about might not be the thing that you care about or that's important. And you know, it's all about compromise. And so every facet is so vital. The science is vital, the opinions are vital, the local knowledge is vital. And so we try really hard to capture all of our meeting notes and have those available to the public, especially because, like we said before, a lot of times, I mean, this is a lot of work. Our original meetings were all day. It was once a month. It was from 9 to 4. It's a big commitment, even for folks that are even for folks who were getting paid to be there. Now think about the ranchers that were just they were actually losing money by being at our meetings, you know, because they were leaving their productions. So anyway, I'm kind of rambling. I didn't really think about everything that I was going to say, but I wanted to say that I really appreciate you guys listening. And I think I just want you to remember how much time and energy and effort it takes and the compromises that are made along the way just to try new things. So I guess I'll just leave it with that.
Okay. Thank you, guys. Let's get a round of applause for all our presenters in here. That was great. All right. So first I want to address the virtual audience. You guys can't see me. I'm going to walk over. So we have, hi. We have a small group activity coming up. So all of you I'll let you know what we're doing. But we are going to run that activity virtually as well. So we have multiple facilitators that are going to be facilitating the online activity. So come back at 10:25 after our break, and you're going to take part in the activity too. All right, everyone in the room. So I think what we should do is maybe take a 10-minute break. You can get coffee, snacks, go to the bathroom. Then we are all going to walk down to the Elks Lodge together. And the address is in the agenda. It's 4 blocks down. We're going to walk together. We won't leave anyone behind, stick with a buddy. But it's down 118 North Broadway, so just down Broadway Street. So we are gonna walk together and try to get there by 10:20 and get set up in our small groups. It's gonna be great. Then we're gonna have lunch over there. And then just about an hour after lunch, we're gonna wrap things up. And we're gonna hear from Jeremy, which will be great. And oh, grab a pastry on the way. Grab a coffee on the way. Anything else? Okay. Bring a smile. Bring a smile. Thanks, you guys. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, you get me again. I want to make sure that people in the back can see the screen. Is it pretty good? Okay, good. So yeah, as we mentioned before, in our remaining time, you're going to get an opportunity to participate in a collaborative landscape scale conservation planning process focused on a novel landscape that I'll describe in a little more detail in a minute here. And the scenario that is that you're going to be part of a mixed stakeholder group at your tables, working together to develop a spatially explicit management plan priorities that support landscape scale conservation of sagebrush rangeland. And the framework you're going to be using aligns with the sagebrush conservation design that Chad introduced yesterday. And the overall strategy, as a reminder, with this design is quite simple, whereby maintenance of areas of sagebrush that are already in good shape should receive priority. In other words, the best chance of success and the most prudent use of resources are associated with efforts to keep the good good. I think we heard that from Stacy Davies as well. So the team that assembled this design first identified patches of high sagebrush ecological integrity as being those with abundant sagebrush, native understories, and minimal threats from invasive annual grasses, conifer expansion, and human modification. And second, they identified places where these patches converged to create large and intact sagebrush landscapes. And these areas were mapped as core sagebrush areas, which are illustrated in the dark blue on this map. And next, the team identified areas that represented opportunities to grow the core. And these are the areas adjacent to the core rangeland that are shaded in light blue on this map. And these areas are being impacted by threats such as invasive annual grasses like shown in these photos, but still possess enough ecological integrity, or to put it more simply, desirable perennial vegetation to be somewhat readily recoverable. And these growth opportunity areas also include rangelands being impacted by conifer expansion, and which once treated, especially those that are kind of in the early phases of expansion, we're pretty confident over time can be readily recovered into core habitat or core rangeland. And then the tan areas on the map, or yellow, I'm not good with colors, represent rangelands that have been persistently converted to something other than sagebrush, such as invasive annual grassland in many cases, unfortunately. So as Chad mentioned yesterday in his keynote, this map product is very useful at sort of the sagebrush biome level for identifying broad areas that should be prioritized for conservation attention and resource allocation. But it's perhaps a little less useful when we drill down into the scales at which management planning occurs and is implemented, especially with regard to informing the primary threats to sagebrush core areas that we should be concerned about, and for informing which specific factors or threats are preventing growth opportunity areas from becoming core rangeland. And the concepts underlying this strategy, as Megan talked about earlier, can still be applied at this scale, but we have to turn to different data sets and tools in order to do that. And that's what you're going to get practice doing today in this landscape that I'm showing here in Central Oregon. And as you can see, this area contains a large amount of core habitat. And importantly, it also contains ample opportunity to grow the core, shown by the dark and light blue areas on this zoomed in map respectively. So that just a little more on the area. The area is just over 580,000 acres in size. So it's a pretty large chunk of ground that we're going to look at today. And like most sagebrush rangelands, it's prone to periodic fire. And a portion of this area recently burned in a 50,000 acre Cinder Butte fire in 2017, which I'm showing that perimeter on the map there, which was a major factor contributing to a reduction in the amount of core sagebrush rangeland in this planning area, for our exercise. And so full disclosure on how, and I'm the one that came up with the boundaries of this, for our example. I primarily established the boundaries out of convenience. So the area is bounded by Highway 20 to the north, Highway 395 to the east, the Christmas Valley Highway to the south, over to the Frederick Butte Road over on the west side. So it's bounded by major roads in the area. Okay, I think that's what I was going to do in terms of any questions about the area? Sure, Autumn. Right. So we are emphasizing, core rangeland in terms of its ecological condition and not necessarily core sage-grouse habitat. So that's a good clarification. Is there any other? Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to Vanessa.
Great, thank you, Dustin. So now I'm going to actually walk you guys through what you're going to be doing today. My clicker works, and so does my pointer. This will be fun. Great, so your group's task is going to be that you are currently sitting at a table. You are a mixed stakeholder group, and you will be working together to identify management priorities. And so ultimately, we want you to identify areas where you can defend, grow the core, and mitigate impacts on this novel landscape that Dustin just presented. We want to know how you might do this. And we're calling that area, it's the area around that Cinder Butte fire. It's that Cinder Butte area. So more specifically, Where can you do all this? We think that it would be a lot to do all in one step. So we're going to break it up into 3 separate sections for you today. And it's going to be, how do you specifically break it up into manageable units, priorities, and activities? And this 3-step process, we think, starts with the eco state map. So I'm not going to go through this in a great more detail because we've had Chad and Megan and others. You do have some resources at your table. Your facilitator can help remind you. We'll have Megan floating around too if you're still confused on what eco state is. But ultimately, we're thinking of that core. Thank you, Autumn. Not sage grouse core. We're thinking of core as kind of these green areas. So green areas, maybe some of this blue, which is going to be the perennials. Those all represent perennials. And then we have some of these transitional, maybe those yellows, maybe some of the juniper coming in, maybe some transitional areas. And we have some areas that are really impacted. When we say impacted by threats, we mean invasive annual grasses and juniper. And so instead of just making you do this on your own, I gave an example of what I would do. I didn't want to bias you with my opinion, so I did it in a novel landscape. So this novel landscape is actually the Northern Great Basin Experimental Range, where a lot of us at the research station work. And so I decided to start thinking about this. Okay, how am I going to break up this large landscape? I'm going to first start with core. Looking at this picture here, all my different eco states, I see I have a really big chunk of green. Lots of this good dark green, lots of light green. So I went ahead and I just drew, I'm more of a lumper here. So I just drew all of this blue that you see. I called that core. I know that there's a couple areas, maybe some pockets. I decided to not be nitpicky and call those out, called that all core. And then up here, you can see a lot of that dark brown. We're really heavily impacted by juniper. So I drew a little line to try to call that out, heavily impacted by juniper. Now you can see this mess of all these different colors. There's a lot going on. We have invasive annual grasses, but we also have juniper. So I tried to draw a line around all of that. I said, you know, that's heavily impacted by juniper and invasive annual grasses. If you drew these lines, I'm sure they would look a little bit different. That's totally fine. That left me with this area that actually it has, I didn't know what to do with it at first. It has a lot of green, but it has a lot of that dark brown. So I decided I'm going to call that growth opportunity. You have this weird little claw where it was getting to be a little bit of a splitter, but I really wanted to keep that green with that growth opportunity. Okay, so that's all you're doing for step 1. And your facilitator is going to help guide you. You are just going to identify 4 sagebrush areas, growth opportunity areas, and heavily impacted areas. We're not going to go into any more detail than that. Your polygon should be colored in just like mine was, even though it's a different shape, with those different polygons. And I think at this point, am I going to advance my slides? Doesn't want to keep advancing. At this point, we can go into the breakout sessions, and we're going to have 25 minutes. So I think it's okay that my PowerPoint froze because, yes, you'll have 25 minutes. Taking this, ooh, we're being recorded. We took this big landscape and we took a first cut at breaking it up into some areas. Then we refined it with a little bit of information. We didn't want to throw everything at you at once. So now you're going to have a whole lot more information. And that's going to be on under the step 3 on this handout. There's a whole lot of layers that you're going to really be able to dive into. They include things such as values. So our sage. So when I was first looking at this landscape, I thought, what about the sage grouse areas? Turned on that layer, nothing. No packs in this area. What about different types of sage grouse habitat? Well, it was pretty much all the same, not really sage grouse in this specific example. What about BLM treatments? Are there areas that we might want to keep investing in? Or maybe we had some successes that we want to protect. Well, this isn't actually BLM land, it's Northern Great Basin Experimental Range, so that wasn't very informative either. So then my thought process went to, all right, I decided I was going to protect the core in step 2. Let's focus there. Let's look there and zoom back into the eco state. I knew I glossed over a few things. And I glossed over what looked like infestations of invasive annual grasses. So here you can see 11 different circles, where I circled these different infestations. Of course, in real life, you would go ground truth this if this is an area that we decided to work in. I said, okay, well, let's think about infrastructure. My slides aren't going to advance for me, are they? Okay, so let's turn on a roads layer. We have a roads layer. I had a hunch that there might be a pattern behind the invasive annual grasses. And it turns out that 9 of the 11 patches are right around these roads. And so using this information, I decided I'm going to prioritize in this area, first investigating, are these invasive annual grasses? If so, directing weed treatments there. And then also, whatever money I can find, I'm going to direct at spraying the vectors within this polygon. This is that area that is more likely to transition to invasive annual grasses, and that is the main thing that might keep it from being core into the future. You want to protect that core. All right, so now if I had more money, I decided to give an example of 2 opportunities. So you guys can just pick on one as your top priority. My second priority for this area is thinking, I now want to grow that core. I have this great core area. Let's take a dive into the growth opportunity. And so I kind of zoomed in and looked right around the border of the core and noticed that I actually have quite a bit of green still. I do have a decent amount of juniper, but not nearly as much as some of those other areas. And so I decided the landscape planning tool has a really cool tool that you can measure. Don't necessarily make a facilitator do that. It'd be tricky to get that shape off again. But if you're on your own using it, you can measure it. And I measured it, and this was about 435 acres. Then they have the really cool thing that Megan highlighted. You can do the eco state summarization. So I went ahead and did that as well. And I learned that these brown pixels of juniper, it was only about 100 acres. And so this to me seems like a really good bang for my buck, where I'm growing core, and it's maybe not going to be as costly as if I was doing it up here in this area that is really dense. So for you guys, I want you to start looking at your menu of options, start having a conversation. Maybe you want to learn about land management, might be a good consideration. Is it a horse management area? Is it wilderness study area? Does that influence where you may or may not want to work? Are you really focused on wildlife? Or do you want to really dive into areas that maybe BLM has been focusing a lot of their treatments? So there's a menu of options. You don't have to consider all of them, but as a group, start having conversations about what ones you want to talk about first. And then have your facilitator click on and off those different layers. And after this step, I'm going to give you a 10-minute warning so you can start thinking about some questions. A couple of the groups will be called on, but not until after lunch. So, all right, get at it.
Question.
Oh, yeah, question.
Can you go back to your couple of slides, please? There, right there.
Oh, that one, Juniper one?
There you go.
Yeah.
So the heavily impacted juniper and IAJs on the top right
Yeah.
there. Just to, what is the rationale for not, or is it an assumption we are protecting that border right there between the heavily impacted and the core? Or is that a protected core priority, those areas?
So that's the conversation you'd be having right now. So yeah, if you had done this map, you might have said, actually, it'd be much smarter to work right here and protect that core. Having a conversation of how is that a fire break? Maybe something like the wildfire collaborative did. Maybe you really your top priority is protecting that interface, however you see fit. So that's another good example. If not the one that I thought of first. Any other questions? Anything that's not keeping with us? Okay, then let's keep rolling. You're gonna have 25 minutes for this section.